basically which are used in questions. If they are talking about criticality of something, then it is importance. If they speak about sensitivity, then it is confidentiality, right? So confidentiality, integrity, and availability, three pillars. I hope everybody understands that as far as CISM is concerned, right? So when the question speaks especially about criticality, then they are actually talking about importance. The question has any word where they talk about data sensitivity, information sensitivity, etc., then they're talking about confidentiality. They're talking about impact. What exactly is impact? What's a consequence, right? Risk. Please remember this: threat multiplied by vulnerability, or likelihood multiplied by impact. These are the two most important things that you have to keep in mind, because uh, for those who have already undergone the training, I'm sure you would have known that people would have already told you that irrespective of whichever domain it is, the focus always is to manage and mitigate the risk, to make sure that your enterprise always is within the acceptable level or acceptable limit of the risk, right, to the enterprise. So when you talk about every single question, definitely keep in mind, make sure that you are training your mind in such a way that you are talking and thinking risk, and do not make any assumptions. As I was telling you some time back, please limit your thought process only to that particular question, nothing more. Okay, if you start getting in more assumptions into place, but what if yesterday I saw this, something happened there, what about that news, what about this event? No. If you start making those assumptions, then you would not be able to get the correct answer. The next part, in terms of guidelines, what I would strongly recommend is carefully look at the highlighted terms. So, and this is where you would find, a similarity between CISM, CISSP, these kind of exams, where one question may have more than one correct answer. However, the question is asking you to pick either the most, the best, the primary, the first, the main, the greatest, the least, right? So, or the last. So these are the terms which are there in the question. So please make sure that you are reading the question correctly. What exactly does that mean? We'll come to know in a short while. I will tell you. So you have to get used to reading a question with the right kind of emphasis on that particular term, so that when you are uh, when you are practicing itself, you are tuning your mind, you're building enough muscle memory so that you're not missing that part. And when you are looking at it, okay, these are the two, and when you're practicing, there is another phenomenon that you would definitely go through, right, which is, of the four, you'd find two are extremely close. And so the two are the right answers. So that's where this helps you in terms of the right kind of emphasis on whether it is the most or the best or the first, whatever that emphasis is, what the question wants you to emphasize on, and you would be able to pick the right answer that way, right? Next part, when you are going through and when you are practicing, okay, and prior to that, prior to practicing, when you are actually going through the content, the training content, either you are going through the ISACA manual, or you are going through some kind of a recording, right? Please make sure that the focus is always in terms of understanding the sequence of events. What is it? Like, for example, let's look at it. What is risk assessment, right? If you look at risk management, what comes first? Okay, risk identification, and then risk analysis, and then risk evaluation. Okay, together it is called what? Right? There is a change somewhere. So what would you do first? Okay, if you I would do risk assessment. So if I have to do risk assessment, what is the first thing as part of risk assessment that I need to do? Risk identification. If I need to identify the risk, basically risk is applied to what? Some kind of an information asset, right? So for that, first of all, I need to understand that particular asset. What exactly is that asset? Is that asset identified? Is that asset valued? Is that asset rightly classified? You understand the thought process is something that you need to build as you are going through. Now, those who are very good at reading and synthesizing information, even for them as well, I would strongly recommend this methodology, because if you are really good at reading, bless you, absolutely a great trait, right? I cannot. Okay, the first thing of course, over the years I have graduated from one page to maybe 15, 20 pages. But then even today, that's the threshold. If I cross beyond that limit, I slowly start dozing off, right? I have to make sure that I make certain changes. But if you can read through content, through books, wonderful. But even if you're reading through content, make sure you develop a mental mind map in terms of how exactly the sequence, the timeline of different activities in the context of information security within your enterprise should be. Unless and until that happens, you will not be able to do the answer the questions correctly, because that sequencing, because when you, for example, the second point which is mentioned here, when you are writing something, when you're developing a policy, the thought is different, the considerations are different. Okay, but after you have developed a policy, the thought and considerations are different. When you have already analyzed the risk, when you have already evaluated the risk, right? As part of risk assessment, you are only focusing on assessing the risk. But after your assessment is already done, then your focus will be on risk response. Are you going to accept the risk? Are you going to mitigate the risk? What exactly are you going to do? So you need to look at and focus on each of that, right? What is the scope of the activity that is being described? If the question is talking about an activity, right? Or if the question is talking about outcome driven. So for each of the activities which you are doing, again, let's look at, let's say, risk management, right? Risk assessment. If you are actually doing risk assessment, what is the outcome, right? If you are actually writing policies and procedures, what is the outcome? Okay, if you are doing once after you have done a control design, when you are actually when you've identified controls, right? After you have deployed the controls, implemented the control, what is the outcome, right? When you're testing a control, what exactly is the outcome? So for each of those activities that happens as part or the under the umbrella of information security, what exactly is the input, what is the output, right? That's the mantra. That's, please make sure that you keep all these you build these mental maps. The next part when it comes to guidelines that I tell people is the practicality of examination. Okay, while I would always recommend you not carry what you do in your current work to the exam, there are certain fundamentals which I would strongly recommend people to follow. Number one, if there is something written, it doesn't mean it is followed. For example, there is a policy which is written, right? A password needs to be changed, every 20 days, 30 days, 90 days, whatever. Okay, as part of your password policy. The password string to be like this, minimum so many characters. The password should not be shared, right? Now, how can you ensure that it is being followed, right? You need to verify that. You need to ensure, okay, the effectiveness of password is just one example. uh, Swiping your card, no tailgating. How do you make sure, right? So those reviews, those audits, all that you can conduct. That's the point that you need to keep in mind. So just because there is a policy, it doesn't guarantee adherence to it. Doesn't guarantee compliance to it. Okay. Same is the case with respect to organizations, different rules and different rules which are there. Of course, there are policies, there are standards, and there are certain rules, do's and don'ts. If any of that is not followed, number one, you have a risk. However, in certain cases, certain policies may be outdated, right? So just because you have not reviewed the policy doesn't mean that not following it or non-compliance to that is always incorrect. So sometimes when you are seeing that something is not correctly followed, then the best thing for you to do is to start with a risk assessment. Start with a risk assessment and you would be able to understand, am I really supposed to do something? I mean, maybe in some scenarios, once you have completed your risk assessment, you would basically go back and update the policy. Again, with respect to different types of questions, okay, if there is a plan for a problem, initiate the particular plan. Okay. There will be questions where you would be asked about who among the four personalities is the right person to sponsor any information security initiative. Okay, the answer generally is always the highest. Okay, so if you're looking at, let's say, CISO, CIO, CEO, and CFO, who among them is the highest, then the answer is always CEO. Okay. However, to get this right, you should be able to understand the commonly accepted hierarchies, across industry. Okay. So without understanding that, without spending time on that, please do not get to the exam yet. Right. uh, Most important point, there are questions which would be trying to confuse you, which will try to test your English, and then try to confuse you with the number one, try to give you management, senior management as one of the options. So when you start preparing, given the emphasis on senior management in the governance and risk management domains, people tend to choose management as the answer. So that's not always the answer. Okay. When you say, if there are no conditions, like without any preconditions, or absolutely no, or absolutely everything, or always, when anything which is any answer which says never, all, always, these kind of things generally they don't tend to be the answer, right? Again, this is something, these are few, I would say, tips and tricks. As you're practicing, please remember it so that it builds, as a memory, as a map. That way you would be able to avoid those pitfalls, right? uh, Again, best practices, international standards, these are generally not the answers as well. So when somebody says that, the question would be like, okay, you would want to start writing policies. Okay. And how exactly, or what exactly would you depend your policies on? Industry best practices, international standards, your peer review, as per your organization's information security strategy, right? So when you look at international standards, best practices, your peers, etc., those would definitely, at the start of your preparation, those would definitely look like the right answers. However, they're not, right? Everything should start with the organization, and organization as a priority. Okay. And RACI matrix, another area that I would definitely emphasize on, right? The difference between who wants to ensure, and which is who is making you do it versus who is doing it, right? So the focus should basically be there on that as well, right? Another example is, another point that you need to focus on or look at is who is ultimately responsible. Okay. Who would ensure a task was performed, who would resolve the issues between security operations, IT, sales, provide support and commitment to security, who owns the policies, who provides oversight. When you look at all of these, then only then management is the answer. Okay, so we just spoke about why management is not the answer. So this is what I would consider.